Hey my friends, so we are currently editing my second book, Dying with Regrets, here live on social media. So when I spoke about it last and you guys were here, we was talking about how I walked into a restaurant very close to where I used to live, and I saw the girl of my dreams, my girlfriend, sat there with another guy. However, I managed to pluck up the courage to go on my first ever solo trip to Cape Town, and as I done that, I pushed myself outside of my comfort zone, and I actually learned to love myself whilst I was away for that very short time. However, we're going to talk about what happened when I came back to reality. So the next chapter is titled, I Can't Do This. The day I arrived back at home, I was still charged up from my trip to Cape Town, but only until I stepped through the front door of what was now an empty home. I instantly broke down in tears after realising that all I had left were the two things I hated most, which was my own company and the sound of silence. The thought of what happens now was thrown right in my face when I realised that the only inmate in this prison was me. That ear-piercing sound of silence, which I could only compare to the sound of death, made the thunderous thoughts inside my mind multiply. And because of this, I would quite often leave the radio playing all day and all night. I couldn't think straight, and I was constantly using all my precious energy to try and wrap my mind around why this had around why this had happened to me. I'll do that as well. Around why this had happened to me. 1 second, guys. Bear with me. Why this had happened to me. I was so upset, as all I could think about was the perfect life that we had created together and how it was all going to be thrown away. Although I couldn't stop thinking about and focusing on the past, I was so desperate to sell the house so we could both move on with our lives. But for some reason my ex did not want to sell the house, even though she was not really living there anymore. From then on, the days turned into weeks, and then the weeks turned into months. I was not progressing in life, and I was trapped in a place where I desperately didn't want to be. I had many choices I could have made, but for whatever reason I failed to make any once the depression began to kick in. I was so unhappy being by myself, as I felt lost, unloved, and absolutely worthless. I soon realised that I had become so heavily reliant on somebody else to provide me with what I once believed was happiness, that I hadn't even actually known what true happiness was. I'd spent 6.5 years believing my happiness came from this external source who I called my girlfriend, and now that she was not there anymore, I did not know what I was going to do. I started to convince myself that my life was over, and I would constantly repeat to myself, I am never going to be happy again. We need to be so very careful when using two of the most powerful words known to man, which are the words I am, because whatever you use after I am is what we believe and what we eventually become. This is because we have now created an identity about ourselves. So when you're using these words next, you must make sure that there is something extremely empowering that comes after them. Just as it said, you are what you eat, the same is true for you are what you absorb, because you are a direct reflection of what you both consciously and unconsciously consistently consume. Now it had gotten to the point where it wasn't even like every day was a Groundhog Day anymore. I felt myself fall that little bit deeper down as each day dissolved and disappeared right in front of me. I would call my dad every evening and have the exact same conversation over and over again. And because of this, I began to feel like I was a complete burden. So instead, I ended up bottling everything up, which in return made things so much worse. Understand that emotions are there to be Let me say that again, guys. Understand that emotions are there to be felt, because emotions are the reporters for the soul. When we are happy, we tell the whole world how happy we are, from the huge smile on our face and the big spring in our step. However, when we are sad, we still feel the need to always be happy. Just know that unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in much uglier ways. I remember these bottled up emotions would be like a shaken up bottle of champagne, and they would usually end up bursting out all over the people who were really there trying to help me the most. My health, both physically and mentally, was rapidly deteriorating. In this moment, my main priorities were drink, drugs, pubs and clubs. I was so fed up with turning up at the gym and putting on a fake smile every evening, so I stopped going. I was so fed up. Let me read that again. I was so fed up with turning up at the gym, putting on a fake smile every evening, I just stopped going on and change that. Thank you for bearing with me, guys. We're just editing this live. So I'm going to read that once more. I was so fed up with turning up at the gym and putting on a fake smile every evening, I just stopped going. I realised that I had become a fantastic liar, because if anyone asked how I was, I would always say I'm great, when I was in fact the total opposite. I wouldn't feel like cooking most nights, and quite often would decide to not eat any food at all. I also began to suffer from an extreme case of irritable bowel syndrome due to all the stress I had put myself in. My personal hygiene started to suffer, as I would spend the weekends lying in bed crying and wouldn't even get up to eat, drink or wash myself. It got to a point where I couldn't sleep because I was sat up all night long Googling the words, how to be happy. I remember a handful of evenings where I had 0 hours sleep, as I had become so very desperate to find some sort of external happiness. I would have tried anything to make myself feel happy at this point. My weekends would consist of either sitting at home and crying by myself, or the polar opposite, which was to go out partying into the early hours of the next morning, whilst trying to convince myself that I was happy doing this. I went from the guy who had a handful of drinks per year to the guy who had a handful of drinks per night. I was digging the ditch that I had created myself even deeper and deeper. I noticed it had got to the point where I found myself all the way back to those pre-injury days dossing around in bars and nightclubs. However, this time I did not have the discipline to say no to cocaine. In all honesty, all discipline had gone out of the window, as I just wanted to be happy no matter the price. Everyone around me seemed to be happy sniffing cocaine, so why wouldn't I try and find happiness there too? And I did, but not for very long, as I had to keep topping myself up with this nose candy. It felt great whilst I was heavily sedated by the cocktail of drink and drugs. However, once it had worn off the next day, that ditch I was in got a whole lot deeper. I went from the guy who was so anti-drug to the guy who spent the next few months relying on this shit for happiness. And trust me, you can't buy true happiness, nor can you find it anywhere other than from within. I wanted out of this nightmare I was living in, and I didn't realise in order to get out, I first had to go in, because the only way out of your nightmare is to go through it. There is a huge difference between happiness and true happiness. Remember what I said earlier about how those materialistic items may make you happy in the moment, but that pleasure doesn't last forever. Well, have you ever bought a new car, phone, or home? How did that make you feel right then? Great, right? You felt so happy. But how long did that happiness last for? A week, a month, and sometimes even a year or longer. However, once you begin to normalise the feeling of owning these materialistic items, the initial spike in happiness that you once felt begins to dwindle. You then start to crave that fancier car, the newest phone, and a bigger house. You slowly become dissatisfied with what you currently have, and then you're running on the average man's treadmill of false happiness, whilst constantly chasing after something that isn't even there. All I could focus on in that moment in time was my past and all the perceived negatives. Little did I realise your perception will shape your reality, and what you focus on expands. Every weekend things became worse. What the fuck had my life come to? I felt that I had no purpose or point in living on this earth, and I'd be lying if I said that I never had suicidal thoughts running through my mind. But the scary thing was, I knew if I was going to do anything serious, I would have gone all the way, because I always follow through to the end with any plan I made in my life. I'm an all or nothing kind of guy. The only thing that stopped me from the only thing that stopped me from impulsively acting on my thoughts was that deep-rooted fear of death. I knew deep down that there is no coming back from death, but I could not go on like this, and I needed urgent help. Thank you, my friends, for listening to this section. So we're going to stop here. Let's see you on the next one. If you want to get yourself on the wait list for this, get to dyingwithregrets.ryannurse.com or send me a DM and I'll send you over the link. Thank you, my friends. Goodbye.